Hello, and welcome to the first video of Beyond Tikkun Olam, History, Meaning, and Relevance of Jewish Activism in America. I'm Judith Rosenbaum, a Bronfman Fellow from 1990 and faculty from this past summer, 2013, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to teach this course. I'm looking forward to learning with all of you. In the video each week, I will introduce the themes of the week and give some background framing, as well as go over what some of the assigned readings are. I won't go into too much detail about the texts because I hope that you'll take the time to explore them, hopefully in Chavruta if you have the opportunity to do that, and then we will also be discussing them later on in the week in our online session. The themes for this week are why Jews and social justice, where does this legacy come from, and what has it meant historically? And I will begin by giving you a little bit of background on those topics. So I believe that there are several roots to the Jewish commitment to social justice. One is historical, our experience as an oppressed minority, both mythically in terms of the commandment to recall that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and what it has meant to come back to that as a touchstone of our communal understanding. And also historically, in terms of the immigrant experience, in terms of the Shoah, in terms of various other periods in history when Jews have been a marginal community. There's also a legal imperative. Jewish civil law, as represented in Halakha, has a lot to say about topics including workers' rights, fair business practices, dealing with poverty in your community. And while civil law has been kind of de-emphasized in Jewish education because it was easier to focus on ritual practice in a time when Jews had little political power, there is still quite a bit there for us to sink our teeth into. And I believe that even if those pieces were not kind of foregrounded within Jewish education as the core of our responsibility, they certainly have been present as something that has influenced Jewish understanding of our obligation to social justice. Even in periods when Jews have had more political power, Jews have often adapted to the kind of Christian model of religion as governing private life, and therefore not chosen to apply the civil law to our understanding of core Jewish practices. But as I said, I think that its presence there has been an important shaping force. There's also a general Jewish religious optimism about the power of humans to affect change in the world. The biblical prophets, for example, and their belief in a messianic era, the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, which believes that humans can help repair the cosmos, all have an important kind of urgency in terms of understanding the role of human beings in bringing about change in the world. And finally, there's the sociological realities of living as a Jew in a diverse world and beginning to understand our fate as linked to the fate of others around us. So all of these traditions undergird the Jewish relationship to social justice, with different communities obviously feeling more or less influenced by the different components. When we look at the historical background to Jewish activism in America, I think that we need to begin looking really primarily in the period of mass immigration from Eastern Europe that spans basically from 1880 to 1924. Many of the strong Jewish service organizations, social service organizations, such as National Council of Jewish Women or American Jewish Congress, are founded during this period by already acculturated previous generations of Jewish immigrants, mostly from Central Europe, although some were earlier arrivals, Sephardic Jews who came from places like Amsterdam and Brazil. And they were concerned about the fate and influence of the poorer Eastern European waves of immigrants who were arriving in large numbers and sort of threatened to overwhelm them in terms of their status as the central Jewish community. We also, obviously, in this period, really have to look at the Jewish radical tradition. And when we look at these radical strands of Jewish socialism and labor activism, there are debates among historians about how much immigrants brought that radicalism from Eastern Europe versus finding it on the Lower East Side. There certainly were Jewish revolutionaries in Russia in the early part of this period, but not a huge number. Many Jews did encounter radical ideas in their exploration of secular culture during the Enlightenment and in their internal migrations within Eastern Europe as they moved to cities. But the mass movement of Jewish radicalism arose primarily in New York City in the beginning of the 1890s, or beginning in the 1890s. And in part, this had to do with the nature of New York in that time. During the immigrant period, New York City was, in that turn of the century period, New York City was a sort of laboratory of political and cultural innovation, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and it was a very fertile period. And that shaped the Jewish community in that immigrant time. And this then influenced Jews back in Eastern Europe, some of whom then came to the U.S., particularly after the aborted 1905 Russian Revolution, and added their numbers to the radical community that was already here. What drove Jews to political activism, particularly these radical forms? I think, first of all, Jews were attracted to socialism and other forms of radicalism because its utopianism resonated with Jewish culture. It provided an outlet for Jews to translate their more traditional biblical and ethical utopianism into the socialist movement. One historian has referred to Jewish socialists in this period as, quote unquote, a prophetic minority. These were people who had grown up immersed in traditional Jewish culture, with its moral commandments, its messianic belief system, traditions of mutual aid, of tzedakah, of communal responsibility. And although these people had left the traditional Jewish community behind, these ideas were deeply internalized. For example, the Yiddish radical poet Morris Winchevsky wrote, "For almost everything I write, I have to thank Isaiah, that poet-preacher who entered my heart and mind with love for orphans and widows and other defenseless and oppressed people." So this is an example of somebody who was really anti-religion, but still embraced the prophetic tradition in that way. And radicalism became a kind of surrogate or secular religion that brought into it some of these ideas. Certainly, there were also Jewish radicals who saw themselves as following in a kind of Jewish heretical tradition stretching back to the Talmudic figure Elisha ben Abuya, all the way to Karl Marx and the people of their own generation. For non-radicals, too, civic activism could serve as a form of religious expression. For example, the Reform movement promoted ethical monotheism over ritual or religious observance, and therefore, for both radicals and non-radicals, activism offered a way to work towards this kind of universal vision while also holding on to one's own particular tradition in a way that felt comfortable. So that also means that even within the socialist community, for example, there were socialists who formed particular specific Jewish organizations like the Bund, which was founded in 1897 and was the most prominent of the Jewish socialist organizations. I think it's also worth noting that the utopian language of radical movements fit in with already existing American tropes and visions of what America was. So, for example, we can see, dating back even to the Puritans, a sense of America being understood as a promised land, as a land of freedom, as a place where people could fulfill God's will in the New World. So the language of utopianism that came about in Jewish communities was not foreign to America. It kind of dovetailed into American sensibilities as well. Of course, there's also a self-interest component that we can see here, the hope and belief that political activism could solve the problem of anti-Semitism. So socialists believed that a socialist revolution would bring about the end of anti-Semitism. And likewise, American Jewish organizations that were originally founded as defense agencies to protect Jews, over time broadened their agendas to seek civil rights and justice issues more generally. And they began with group interest, worked for cultural pluralism as a way of seeking equality and safety for Jews, fighting discrimination in that realm, and then creating more opportunities for Jews and other minorities. And this came about as helped bring them to, and was influenced by their realization that the fate of Jews would be interwoven with the fate of their neighbors. So that self-interest component kind of bled into a greater, broader sense of communal responsibility, but there was that kernel there. So that's a very quick background, and we'll have the opportunity to talk about some of these things more in depth in our online session later in the week. I want to give you a little bit of introduction to some of the readings as well. I've given you 4 primary sources that are short and 2 secondary sources. I'm most interested in having you explore the primary sources in your chavruta, and the secondary sources are really more for your own background. So I've labeled them as optional, but feel free to read them, obviously. I'll explain a little bit about what each of the sources is. The secondary sources are, one is an article by Rabbi Jane Kanarek about the original uses of the term tikkun olam. I think that is a useful subject to explore, given that the term is used so broadly in America these days as to almost make it devoid of any kind of meaning. I've also given you a chapter from Rabbi Jill Jacobs' book, There Shall Be No Needy, which is a guide to doing social justice work, and I think it provides a really useful frame for thinking about the Jewish context of social justice in America. Then the primary sources. This is the rich historical material that I get really excited about. I've given you two sources that are related to the anarchist Emma Goldman, who's one of my favorites. She was born in 1869 in what is now Lithuania. She had a very difficult childhood there. She came to the States in 1885 with her sister. Both of them were very excited about the possibility of a new world of freedom and justice. But when they arrived here, they found that conditions for immigrants were really not much better than they had been in Russia. And Emma was quickly radicalized and became a prominent anarchist who traveled around the country speaking out on topics like free speech and workers' rights and women's rights and birth control and free love. She spoke to wide audiences. She sometimes spoke in English, sometimes in German, sometimes in Yiddish, as you'll see in one of the documents. She founded her own political and literary magazine called Mother Earth. And although she was anti-religious, she believed that religion was oppressive, she was also very much shaped by her own Jewish experience and roots, and she acknowledged that and remained connected to the Jewish community in some ways, which you can see from the two documents that I've given you, one of which is an ad for a Yom Kippur picnic for free thinkers and radicals, which was advertised in her magazine, and the other is for a poster of a talk she gave in 1899 on tzedakah in Yiddish, and so I've given you a translation of that poster as well. But wanted to give you a sense of some of the intersections of Emma Goldman's work and her and the Jewish community. I've also included something completely different, which is the Pittsburgh platform of the American Reform Movement, written by a conference of Reform rabbis in 1885 to kind of articulate what the movement's approach and perspective on Judaism was at that time. This platform represented the tenets of the Reform movement in America until 1937, when a new platform was written. And I think it's a useful lens for understanding where social action and idealism fit into mainstream understandings of Jewish religion in this foundational period of the Reform Judaism in the 19th century. I have also given you an excerpt of a report on the Commission on Law and Social Action of the American Jewish Congress, covering the periods 1945 to 1957. So this is a much later piece, but I think it speaks to some of the ways that the Jewish community has been involved politically, both in terms of fighting for Jewish interests and also expanding more broadly from that to look at racism and discrimination in America more widely. And I've given you just an excerpt here. The full report is quite long, about 50 or 60 pages. I've given you just the introduction to read. And I also included the table of contents just so that you can see the wide range of topics that the work of the committee covered. I think it's pretty interesting. So as you're reading these documents, I hope you will read them with questions in mind about the values that are reflected in them, what values you see reflected there, the tensions between universalism and particularism, and the different perspectives on Jewish politics and Jewish identity that are represented in these documents. And I look forward to discussing them with you soon. Thank you.